Thank you for joining us for an episode of All About PR. If you're tuning in for the first time, on this podcast, we speak to experts from the field of PR and communication from across the world and bring you an interesting conversation on the subject every week. In today's podcast, we continue our discussion on how you can create a career in communication outside India. What does it take to craft a global career in PR? Is your education in India enough? Is agency work sufficient or do you need corporate experience too? What happens when you move out to a new country? Can you do this on your own or do you have to rely on a company to make that switch for you? Do work ethics and professionalism differ across continents? Is the skill set you acquired enough to give you a head start? And when do you actually start? All great and valid questions. And to answer them today on the podcast, we are joined by Bhushan Rao, Communications and Social Consultant for National Australia Bank, based out of Melbourne, who spills the beans on the secrets of a global career. Bhushan is a marketing communication professional and has worked with multiple companies across India, the UK, Australia, and the wider APAC region. Former social content lead for Microsoft Asia Pacific, he specializes in corporate communication and creating engaging content in the digital social media space. So let's add him on. So thanks, Bhushan. Thanks for coming on to our podcast today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Taranjeet.
Before we start, Bhushan, can you share with us a little more about your journey and how you came across an opportunity that led you to Australia while being in PR?
Yeah, sure. The more I think of it now, I feel like an interesting journey because I can't believe how the opportunities came through. So I started off with basic PR role, I think back in 2011, and was working for one of the bigger agencies in India at that point of time. Picked up a lot of experience and I absolutely loved what I was doing. So working with multiple clients, and as I grew in my space, tried to bite on more responsibilities and grow in that space. Then I also started looking for opportunities of how I could move abroad. And at that point, it was not very easy because, as you can imagine, public relations as a skill is very geographically based. So if you're working in India, for example, it's not like an engineering job that you can do the same job there. So I started researching about visas and how can I personally move abroad without my job taking me. And that's where I found out an option and I just managed to work through it and landed up in Australia. So that's my entire journey in a really small story.
But what was the motivation to move?
Right. So, I mean, I do my master's abroad when I just finished my undergraduate degree and I went to DPA for a year. The experience was amazing in terms of like I went as a student, but I just was exposed to the life and the industry, and also I got a chance to do a couple of internships during my course. So the entire lifestyle, the way people are living their lives slightly differently from us, that kind of made me really interested in doing that and pursuing that way of life. So that was one of the main things. Plus, my sister also moved to Australia and had gone there to visit her while I was working in the PR industry. And just things added up and made me more aware that, okay, I want to pursue if it's possible to do so. So, yeah, that was probably the few reasons that was interesting why I want to go abroad.
Interesting. Was there any professional motivation for you to move abroad?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, all the clients that I worked for, most of them were brands from different countries and investing into India. Like I specifically worked in the automotive and the sports, automotive partner industries. As a part of working in PR, I got to meet a lot of executive level people like CEOs and managing directors, some of them from different countries. And you can actually notice the way in which everyone has a different take in working on campaigns and things like that. So I was fortunate to also work with a team where we had representatives from different parts of the world for the specific client. So I was really interested. Like for me, working with different campaigns, targeting different geographies is always interesting because in marketing we all study about how things are different in different countries, and that's something as a marketing student I was always chasing to understand how will I run a campaign in India and in some other country and what are the different strategies. So that was one of my key reasons why I even considered going abroad.
Interesting. It's always fun when you work with multicultural, multi-country teams as such. Why Australia? Why did you choose to move to that particular country?
Well, there were a couple of options. One was because it was easier to move as a professional there because I had my master's in the UK and I had experience in my field of study. So I did my master's in public relations, and I had experience in that field from India. Australia, because first of all, the industry is really innovative here. So when you look at Asia Pacific as an industry, like it obviously includes India, China, Japan, and the wider Asian region. A lot of company headquarters after Asia are actually they move directly to Australia because the market over there is considered to be developed in this region. So the in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the industry, how it's developed, we have specific levels of expertise that companies demand when they come to new regions. So if you see a lot of senior marketing leaders, or for that matter, even managing partners, are from Australia who also work in Singapore and Malaysia and Hong Kong. So because of the experience that brands have and the market situation in Australia, there's a lot of opportunity. And Australia doesn't really, I mean, the year when I moved in, the population was not big and they were looking for people with specific expertise to come in and take up their residency. So that worked out best. And from my experience of living in the UK, I thought Australia was much more nicer because you could see the sun every day, and yeah, the UK can make you pretty depressed because you don't get to see the sun at all. But I think the quality of life is something that drew me over because they have a really good work-life balance, and you have a lot of options to follow what you want to do after work in terms of passion. So yeah, it seemed like a good option.
Excellent. So it seemed like almost like a strategic move along with the love for the sun.
It was absolutely. I mean, I don't think love for the sun was the main thing, but it also adds because being from Bombay, I think the coldest winter I've been through was 19 degrees. It's not really cold, but it's also the quality of life. Yeah, overall experience. And I personally believe that this is something that changes from person to person. Somebody will like a place where there is more connectivity, which is somewhere in Europe,
Right.
versus somebody specifically like the US. So it depends on person to person. When this started off, it wasn't very strategic. I was just taking things one day at a time, and things just happened.
Absolutely. It depends on person to person, what city and, what country and culture they would prefer. So let's
Right.
move our conversation into PR. You mentioned
Hmm.
that PR changes when you move across continents or across countries. How is PR perceived differently in Australia as compared to India?
Cool. It was one of my biggest learnings as part of the process, and not just Australia, even when I went to the UK. So obviously, the basic idea is that PR depends on media. So if the media of the specific country is of a
Right.
certain type, that's how the PR industry will evolve. I think that's the basic relation between the media and the PR industry everywhere. India, for that matter, is very fortunate to have such a huge media. In today's date, I don't think lot of countries can even come close to the numbers of media channels, newspapers, and other media options that we have in India. So because of that, because of such a huge demand of media, public relations as a skill and as a industry is pretty huge in India. But in other countries, and that's where the biggest learning that I had was the media is very small, especially in Australia. We have like I think three, four mainstream channels and newspapers. I would think you probably have 10 newspapers, out of which three, four will be regional. Some of them will not add a big readership as well. So the media is very small, and you might have just three people looking after one segment, whether it's finance or stocks or whatever. So you can imagine the effort required to, if you have a client, for example, there's not many options for you to do things. Like obviously, there are ways to popularize your client, but in terms of media, there are just few options as compared to India. So automatically the industry becomes smaller. The skills required for that is more customized, and the understanding of the Australian market is more relevant than just understanding PR as a skill. So that's why I feel there's a massive difference.
Can you share with us what are some of the things you learned in the Indian PR industry right here that have helped you in good stead and have survived continents?
So a lot of things I would definitely give credit to whatever I've learned as an executive when I'm starting off my career. So client management skills, understanding what the client needs, and understanding what are the client's actual products, and thinking from the customer's point, all basic soft skills, and also reading up and trying to upskill as you go as a professional. These things I would think are the most basic things which help me navigate through jobs because if you have these things in your pocket, you're already ready to take up new challenges depending on whichever country or whatever role you're doing.
Absolutely. And what were the things that you needed to upskill to be able to hold a job in your country right now?
I think trying to read up a lot about the situation, why is the company doing certain things, because understanding the context is one of the most important things in any comms or marketing rules. Luckily for us in India, because we grow up in India, we understand, okay, this company can't do this is a problem. We know the history of the region. But if you go to a new country, suddenly you're trying to open up and trying to understand what is going on, why does one company operate in a certain way. So the more, and these things nobody can teach you. So you got to go back into history sometimes, understand what's going on, understand the relevance of the politics in the country, the current affairs, and then read up as much as you can about competition and things like that. And that gives you a lot of ideas on how can you be an innovative marketer and in the com space as well and PR as
So it takes a lot of reading and a lot of research to be able to assimilate into the local culture.
100%. I mean, as somebody who has been into the comms and PR and marketing industry, I feel like reading is definitely one of the biggest skills we as marketers or PR professionals need to have. Because if you don't read and you're not aware of what's going on, it's a really big lost opportunity. So I think definitely, especially when you're abroad, here sometimes it's very difficult to keep track of things if you're not proactive because like
Right.
I mentioned, the media numbers are smaller. Not everybody is following all the events. Like in India, whenever you have a specific launch or something big is happening, for example, the budget, you have so
Right.
many people from the media following that. Whereas
Right.
here in these countries, because the media is smaller, there's not if you can easily miss out on a very big topic that happened in this week. So it takes an effort to be on top of it and be 100% on point for something that you need to follow.
Interesting. When you started out in the country, what were the biggest surprises when you entered the PR industry in Australia?
Right. So, I mean, this was a really big learning, and it actually took me back for a while because I came with a lot of automotive, sports, and corporate PR experience. And when I moved to
Okay.
Australia, I while I kind of knew that okay, maybe things will not be 100% same, but as after working in an industry which is as huge as India, you always take that as confidence, saying that I'm sure I can find a job and go there. But when I first landed in
Right.
Australia, I was shocked because the automotive industry was really small. And I then understood what is the meaning of outsourcing because in Australia, actually manufacturing cars is really expensive because the average salary is much more higher than Asia. So, like automotive companies, they just move to Southeast Asia for manufacturing and they just transport cars to be sold. So, as a result of that, all majority of the marketing jobs are also minimal and they are essentially outsourced to Southeast Asia. So the demand for jobs is very limited. So that was for me that was a big shock because I came from a country which had so many automotive companies. We had local companies, international companies, and it is like a big industry where everyone's fighting to get market share. Whereas here it's more of a luxury space, even though there are more options available but it's very small. So they're more focused on profits rather than pushing out press releases and making more of a larger campaign. Everything is done centrally from Asia. So that was one of my biggest challenges.
What happened next?
So in that case, I mean, you have a very few limited options. Either you stick into what skill you have and try to look at the smaller clients. So in Melbourne, matter, a lot of small boutique agencies are considered to be bigger. The bigger PR agencies, most of them don't even have offices. They probably have two, three people working from their home and that kind of setup. So the smaller focus more on public service and government campaigns and it's very like the industry is very different like Sydney being the bigger city in Australia has more options in terms of PR and corporate PR and fashion PR and things like that. So at that point for me I had to either focus more on building up my resume to that kind of experience or use my existing skills and find what else can I do. So for me, digital marketing has always been an interest, and I just pursued and looked for opportunities, and I found one option where I was creating content for an agency and helping clients with setting up their websites, creating a social strategy, and things like that. That was one of my first jobs in Australia, and I pretty much started as a, let's say, probably a 1 or 2 year experienced person, whereas I had around 4 years experience when I left India. So I had to start from scratch, slowly go up the ladder, and then bigger things happen.
Interesting. So, Bhushan, can you help us understand how is the PR agency scenario different in Australia versus India? Do they function differently?
So the PR industry is fairly different because of the geography as well. To give you an idea, a lot of the bigger companies are either based in Sydney and Melbourne compared to India, where we have companies based majorly in all the bigger cities. We have like 10, 15 cities, and there could be so many other locations they can move. In Australia, the corporate offices are only in Sydney and Melbourne. So obviously the focus is more on those cities, and if you're not working on those cities, there's a good chance you may not get a PR job over there. But in the big cities, again, there is based on the companies that are in that space. So, for example, Melbourne is known to be the financial capital of Australia, whereas Sydney is everything else. So, any manufacturing, any technology, any finance, which is second after Melbourne, all the companies are based there. So, obviously, all the requirements for PR roles are also based in these specific locations. But another aspect to it is the media. So, again, the media here is not as big as India. We have very specific people covering specific things. So, for example, gadgets. So, in India, you have a lot of the mainstream publications also reviewing gadgets, talking about the iPhones, Macs, and stuff. Whereas here, you have independent media specialists who don't really fall into the category of media but are more like bloggers, but really established bloggers. So, these guys are considered to be the main media form for these kind of companies. So that's how it's not just looking at a media vertical, but opening it up, saying that if a specific person understands technology better, how do we get him to review our product? So the experience is more of a bloggerish kind of a thing.
So that must have been a huge surprise for you, when you came from tracking, I don't know, 30 papers in a day to right? That must have been a huge surprise.
It was, I mean, but also I was fortunate enough to work with a few clients who had already gave me that exposure to, how companies deal with markets like these, because I was working with a few German companies who had a very similar approach while I was working in India for different markets. So while the traditional aspect of PR kind of started becoming lesser and lesser important, but the digital space also was growing at the time when I was there. To be honest, it was not very difficult to jump from the traditional aspect to the digital, because again, PR is all about trying to make the most value and trying to push your the story wherever possible. So I feel like it wasn't much of a issue, but yeah, it did take a lot of effort to make sure I'm working hard and I'm giving a good end result to my client. Okay. So I'm going to now shift the conversation to creating a global career, right, for our audiences. If we start planning to do on a global career, what would your advice be? When should you start? Where should you start? What do you do and how do you start? Right. So the first thing which I have also learned the hard way would be not to limit yourself in terms of what you're doing right now, because it's very easy to get used to what we're doing. And when we set goals that, okay, in the next year, I want to do two, three more things. I want to go up the ladder. I want to run behind a title or maybe money or whatever it is. But difference is if you're looking to move geographies, you're not just moving in terms of hierarchy, you're also expanding yourself to a new market that you're not aware of. So if you're looking to move abroad, you need to be ready to also learn and new skills. So one of my favorite terms was unlearning a skill, because when you're in such a dynamic market like India, you can afford to focus only on one thing and keep growing. But when you go to smaller markets where the industry itself is smaller, you can't choose to only specialize in one element of marketing unless you have a job that gives you that option. But I feel like whatever we learn in PR, it's very easy to pick up and take that skill and grow in different spaces. So definitely opening up our minds and not just thinking PR. So even as a professional or somebody working for a client, if we only think about a PR strategy and give us suggestions and do something in PR, instead we focus on a overall comms and a marketing strategy. Also thinking about what will be the sales approach, what will be the customer service strategy, and just trying to connect all the dots to make it a 360 degrees campaign. I think that makes a big difference.
Absolutely. So, when should one start planning and how should one start planning about it?
So the two main elements to this, one is if your company or your job is taking you abroad. In that case, obviously it depends more on the job. The company will take care of all your transition processes and things like that. That I would think that's the easier way out. But obviously with the current situation and unless you're working for a global company nowadays, it's a bit difficult with the whole visa scenarios and things like that. The second option, which I also experienced, was to look for which country is actually granting permanent resident visas. So if you guys have not heard about this before, certain countries actually invite professionals in certain industries to come into the country, start work in their local industry, and they give you either PR or citizenship. PR as in permanent residency. So many countries do that. So Australia, New Zealand, Canada, some parts of the European economy also do that. But trying to understand, you have to do a small amount of research to understand which country is offering PR for your skill. In marketing, generally, it is quite difficult because marketing is considered to be a skill which is more of a Western economy. It's not like, for example, engineering, doctors, and all these technical skills is something which is very easy to move because the job remains the same in any country. Whereas marketing and comms, so comms, for example, when I was studying in the UK, I realized that anybody coming from any British company or university automatically get an advantage because UK is considered to be one of the pioneers of the communications industry. And this is something which is very like it's surprising because we thought US or for that matter, wherever the
Right.
industry is bigger, you'll get that. So things like that. And once you kind of figure out which country you can get PR and then look at the industries and find out are you happy to move there, you can easily start the process. But again, in terms of timing, I don't think there is a specific timing because I've seen so many people moving at different stages of life. I, in fact, met this one gentleman who moved at the age of 45 with two children to Australia, which is, I mean, from my point of view, also that seems really challenging because you are going to be taking risks of not having a job for up to 6 months or 1 year. But at the end, if you're, that gives you happiness of moving to another place and getting that peace of mind, I think it's perfect.
Right. So, how does one get this information about certain professions being invited to a particular country?
Right. So normally all these who are offering PRs for certain professions, they normally have websites and you can pretty much do a Google search depending on what skill and what country you're looking at. Normally every country will refresh this list once a year. Now, for example, if you're not sure how to do this, you can also consult some immigration agents or consultants who help you with these things. But again, that's kind of a mixed bag because some consultants are really good and some
Right.
consultants can be very focused on just meeting their targets, so they may give you some wrong info as well. So I would say you need to have research as your biggest skill in this process because because sitting in India, it's a bit difficult to understand what is the scenario in Australia or for that matter, any specific country. So yeah, you could research yourself or you could contact an immigration consultant or immigration lawyer as well.
Understood. So, you mentioned a very interesting point right now that as a communication expert, right, it's not a very specialized skill as such. You might be great at it, you might be good at it, but it's also something that can be easily replaced by another person. So, one, I'm assuming, has to constantly upskill to stay ahead of the curve, right? What is that one key skill that will help you retain a job in Australia?
Well, that's a very interesting question. To be honest, I'm still finding that answer. But it depends on your commitment and how much, how hungry you are to actually, do more in that space. So, like you rightly said, comms. I mean, see, when you compare comms to a technical skill, it's not something which can be shown on paper. But also, since all of us are comms professionals, we know what we do is we're not just writing random stuff. We put in so much thought into what's being written, each and every word and phrase is emphasized and thought over so many times. But unfortunately, it is not a technical skill, so you can't really document the process of how it works. Every professional brings in a different flavor and can, explain it in a better way. But I feel some of the things, if you look at some of the well-known communicators, or if you
Right.
speak to any of senior comms professionals working for some of the biggest companies, the biggest thing you find in common is that their eagerness of trying to understand what's happening in the industry, learning more about what companies have done, and case studies. So, learning more about case studies, speaking to other people, keeping a tap on what's happening. I think being informed is probably a biggest prerequisite if you want to do really well. And I think it's not just comms; it's also marketing, because
Right.
comms is definitely a big part of marketing. It's a skill which everybody needs to master and understand, and where to go for to get these information and things like that.
Understood. So, since you mentioned, interesting case studies, we have to ask you, share with us one case study that of a campaign that you did while you were in Australia that really helped you understand the entire scenario.
I mean, that's a really interesting one, because I feel like every campaign that we work on leaves certain impressions in your mind that, wow, we didn't know this, and things like that. To give you an example, while I was working for Microsoft in Australia, and it's not necessarily a case study in terms of what we did in comms. It was actually an issue that we faced. So again, in terms of crisis comms kind of a thing, we were launching a new laptop in Australia, and it is considered to be a really big thing for the brand, because the audience in Australia looks at Microsoft as a really competitive brand after Apple, and Microsoft is used in schools, and they get free office in all schools and colleges. So
Right.
that product was really well known, and they were expecting that product to come really faster. But what happened is, when the launch happened, there was a delay of 2 days till they could officially sell the product or things like that. So the approach that we took is, wherever people, we use social listening to actually go in and find conversations where people have asked for more info, and we had campaigns set up to target them, that saying that the product is now available, you can go pre-order it here, you can buy it here. Give an example of why this is important is because normally it's very difficult to understand where your customers are, especially for a new product when a company is entering a new segment in the market. So the reason why the campaign became so popular, because we went behind the individual customers, supplying them with the info, what they were looking for. So generally, it created a positive vibe around comms. And for me, it was a really innovative solution, because I had never used social to that level, where we actually were listening to conversations, obviously in the public space, trying to keywords, target people, and organically go and talk to them. So again, these were not ads. So how we like to use PR versus paid promotions, paid ads. This is organic social content, which is really effective at the end of the day for the brand.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Your top three takeaways for somebody who wants to create a global career.
Cool. So the top 3 points, the number one would definitely be trying to rate your skills. So for example, if you know what experience you have, and also shortlisting experiences that you're interested in. For example, if I'm into PR and I know that I have an inclination towards comms, corporate comms, advertising, digital marketing, and being eager to, learn and get into those industries. Second thing would be to be open to changes. This is the most simplest thing, but the most difficult thing for people to get after, because especially if you've spent a lot of time in an industry where you're used to working at a certain level, and like also getting paid a certain level, when you move industries, sometimes there is a shock that you have to go back to a basic level when you move into a new industry or a new country. Although it is short lived, but sometimes it can be a really big challenge. So if you're having a senior job in India and you want to move abroad by yourself, there is a good chance you may have to start from scratch and go up the ladder. So that is something you have to be open to doing, because it's very difficult to get the same level of job when you go to a new country which you have never been living in.
Absolutely.
And finally, I would say being the best version of yourself. So people don't consider that what job we are doing, it feels like a daily thing. Like, I know this is more of a philosophical saying that try to be the best version of yourself. But I mean, it's so difficult to do that because we are so consumed by our daily chores and daily things to do that, okay, I need to get these five things done today. I don't know. It's a very difficult thought that are we actually putting 100% thought into what we're doing? Like every task that you do as a part of your job, are you giving 100% output of what you want to do? Like if you write a press release, for example, is that the best press release you could come up with today? Is the question I like to ask myself. And that's helped me a lot because if you think about all those scenarios and every piece of work that you give your client or you publish is the best piece of work, then you're giving your 100% at your job, and that definitely makes a difference because your client, your audience, your customers, everybody sees that difference and they choose to continue to work with you.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very relevant advice and goes beyond just developing professional skill sets. Thank you, Bhushan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Lovely talking to you as always.
Oh, my pleasure, Tarunji. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. And yeah, all the best for everyone who is considering moving abroad.
Absolutely. Anything else that you would like to add? Anything else that you think I missed?
I would just think maybe in terms of whenever somebody is looking to go abroad, don't just go abroad because of the idea of going abroad. You should ideally have maybe two or three other reasons why you think that space is important. Because one big thing which people don't really pay attention to is if you have never lived abroad, how do you know is it good or bad for you? So there's a good chance that when you go abroad, you don't like it because it's a personal thing. It's not like everybody who goes abroad loves it. There are a lot of people who don't like the freedom and don't like the independence that you have abroad. For example, having maids and having stuff at home. Any developed country, it's really difficult to have a maid. Even if you have the money, it's a service which is considered to be a premium service. So, and it's nothing wrong. Some people are used to that way of life. Some people are not. So, understanding where you fit in that space would be the biggest challenge, and then that could lead to happiness. So if, for example, if you move abroad after putting a lot of effort and then suddenly you realize you're not happy with that life, then it's a questionable thing which will not really make you happy. So if you know where you fit into that and you make a decision, that will just add to your happiness in the future.
Absolutely. That's very, very relevant advice. Thank you so much, Bhushan. Lovely talking to you.
Same here, Tarunjit. You have a nice day. Talk to you soon.
So that was Bhushan Rao, Communication and Social Consultant, National Australia Bank, Melbourne, giving us an insider's view on how you can start creating a global career with very practical tips and life advice too. Would like to give a shout out to the good folks at PRPOI. This episode was brought to you via a special arrangement with them. Thank you again for tuning in today, and we will see you next week for another interesting conversation from the world of communication.